Hello friends, my name is Rowan. Welcome to my channel, or welcome back if you are not new here. Today I come to you with a topic that I have no choice but to talk about because it's dominating all of my thoughts and nothing else matters in comparison as it feels like my life depends on it, and that is the concept of identifying and detaching from my inner roommate. I first heard the term inner roommate from the book The Untethered Soul by Michael A. Singer. In the book, Singer talks about how this inner roommate or the psyche or the voice in our heads is not actually us. If we're able to observe it, it can't be us, right? It's something separate from us. And that phrase inner roommate stuck with me to the point where I found myself kind of using it intuitively, even though I hadn't read this book in years and actually never finished it, which we'll get into a bit more later. You might hear me using other phrases like inner monologue, inner voice, the voice in my head, but for the most part I'm going to stick with inner roommate because it's the one I find the most helpful. So what is the inner roommate? I like to think of my inner roommate as this sort of unhinged, slightly unstable character that collects and stores all of the programming, stories, traumas, anxieties, beliefs about myself and the world that I have taken in throughout my life and responds to absolutely every experience and interaction I have through the lens of all this programming. Basically, it's the keeper of all my neuroses, right? It's the part of me that's responsible for all the icky feelings of being left out when my friends do something without me, the part that feels overwhelming shame whenever I have a social interaction that's awkward or uncomfortable, the part that nitpicks my body when I look in the mirror, that berates me for having limits and boundaries, that questions all my decisions, that says I'm too much or not enough or there's something wrong with me, that always has a suggestion for how I can change myself, how I should change myself to be more palatable to other people, that straight up tells me horrible lies about how other people feel about me. It has extremely strict, often contradictory, and frankly impossible standards for me. And for some reason, despite the fact that anyone would fail to meet these standards, I still find myself trying. And I always have for as long as I can remember. But why? Well, until pretty recently, me and my inner roommate, who I've taken to calling Lisa, we were like this. Me and Lisa were attached at the hip. Somehow I ended up with this toxic bestie in my head that I wasn't even aware of, but was constantly influencing how I feel about myself and using my insecurities and traumas against me, all in the name of looking out for me. And I listened. Because until I finally became aware of that inner roommate and started to look at her as something separate from me, I thought she was me. I identified with all of those thoughts and I didn't question them. I felt like I was just completely at their mercy no matter how miserable they were making me. I want to share something I wrote when I was journaling about this recently. The voice in our heads has a way of sounding completely reasonable as long as it stays in our heads. That's where its power is. The moment you externalize it, whether to journal about it or to tell somebody else what's going on in your head, it becomes instantly less powerful. Now it's exposed. Now it's under the scrutiny of your conscious awareness, and if you're sharing it with another person, you're also aware of how it must sound from their outside perspective, which is to say, extremely unreasonable and ridiculous. It's like carrying a gigantic backpack unquestioningly until one day you take it off and set it down in front of you, and you're like, holy shit, why was I carrying that? It's huge, and it doesn't even have anything valuable in it. I have been carrying around a backpack full of rocks for way too long. So long that it felt like it was just a part of my body and I didn't even know I could take it off. But now I know I can take it off, and dude, I have never felt so powerful. I really can't stress enough the chokehold my inner voice had on me for as long as I can remember, and the vast, vast majority of that time, I didn't even know it. I mean, I wasn't completely oblivious to it. I often knew that my thoughts were super irrational, but they still held so much influence, and I felt like I was just stuck that way. I chalked it up as something that's just broken in my brain that I have to find some way to live with. But eventually it came to a boiling point where I was just like, something has got to change. Because if it doesn't, I will end up spending the rest of my life in obedience to my every thought, and I would rather perish. It started, I would say, a few months ago when I first became fully aware of this deep-seated obsession I have with perfecting myself. I was starting to realize just how much this obsession was controlling me and impacting my sense of self. And for a while, that awareness kind of just sat marinating in my head, and the obsessive thoughts were more unbearable than they'd ever been because I was now aware of them, but I didn't yet know what to do about it. And then I spent a couple months of my life busier than I'd ever been, not checking in with myself like I normally do on a regular basis. And as soon as that period was over, I got COVID, and I was suddenly without distraction for the first time in months, and all I could do was lay in bed while my mind just got more and more cluttered. And I got pretty depressed, I'm not gonna lie. So once I came out of being sick, my top priority was getting back on my journaling practice, because I knew that was the only way I was gonna get any clarity and release the tension in my head. So I started writing, and it wasn't long before I found myself acknowledging that perfection-obsessed voice in my head. And I wrote out this almost page-long paragraph of all the ridiculous expectations and standards that voice holds me to. I noted that I haven't yet been able to clearly differentiate between me and that voice. And then I ended the entry with this. Current goal: render the voice in my head powerless. Step 1, learn to notice that voice when it's acting up. Step 2, detach from the voice. I didn't know how I was gonna do this. I just knew it was really, really important to me. And I also know from experience that more often than not, consciously deciding you want to make a change is the most important step in the process. Because after that, change usually ends up happening without a terrible amount of effort, as long as I can release control and trust the process. The next day, I was journaling again, and I just naturally found myself recognizing the voice as I was writing. I was reflecting on this small part of me that was feeling kind of down on myself about something, and it clicked, and I was like, oh, this is that voice. This is my inner roommate. And then I realized that a major thing blocking me from recognizing my inner roommate in the moment is the fact that it doesn't often speak in words, which, as a side note, is why terms like inner voice don't feel quite accurate. It's more like it's always just poking me with a stick, but the stick is my insecurities and fears of abandonment and rejection and all my little triggers and whatnot. And that's what's so insidious about it, I think, is the fact that it rarely uses plain language to say what it's trying to say. It operates almost entirely in these nagging feelings of shame and fear. And in order to see it clearly and detach from it, I have to translate those feelings into words. And that's where the real work begins. Once I started translating all those nudges and pokes from my inner roommate into words and could actually physically see them with my eyeballs, it was immediately clear how ridiculous it was, and that this is not something I need to listen to or take seriously. I had taken off the backpack and could see the full extent of its absurdity for the first time in plain view. And now, because I'd put it into words, not only was I detached enough to look at it objectively and decide I don't actually authentically believe these things, I could also respond. I started this practice of writing out what my inner roommate was saying and then writing what I would say back to it in response. For example, if my inner roommate, we'll call her Lisa, were to say,
"Everyone secretly hates all your little quirks and mannerisms and the things that make you you, even your friends,"
I could look at that objectively and say, if that were true, my friends wouldn't choose to spend time with me. But they do. They spend a lot of time with me, actually. If I'm so unbearable, then explain that. And somehow Lisa never has anything to say in response. Another example, Lisa tells me that my need for alone time is abnormal, that even other introverts are more social than I am, and there's something wrong with me for having the limits that I have. So I say, I think my limits are totally normal and acceptable. If someone else expressed having the limits I have, I wouldn't even think twice about it. This process is often uncomfortable. When I'm writing out what my inner roommate is saying, I'm not holding back, I'm not softening it so it's easier for me to digest. I'm just letting it come out very bluntly and honestly. And it can be jarring to see it in plain words because sometimes my inner roommate is brutal. But once I get those words out of my head and into the open, the hardest part is already over. And I don't even feel hurt by it. It's just this momentary shock being like, damn, that was in me. that was just living in here unchecked for who knows how long. Because the thing is, my inner roommate can't hurt me as long as I'm being the objective witness. And that's what this practice is all about. Plus, it's worth it 1,000 times over just for the relief I feel after responding to it from an objective place. Every time I do this, I'm purging. I'm shedding. And that can be uncomfortable, yeah. But after the discomfort, I just feel lighter. Before I personified and externalized my inner roommate in this way, it had this really sick and twisted ability to convince me that I think there's something wrong with me, that I believe all the things it tries to tell me. But now that I see it as something separate from me, I have the objectivity to be able to say, I don't. I do not actually believe any of the things it says. And I can say that confidently because I know for a fact I would not believe those things about somebody else in my place. For some reason, I was never able to detach from that inner voice, even when I knew my thoughts were not logical or reasonable. Like, I could acknowledge they were unreasonable, but I still felt stuck to them, and it was frustrating. And it turned out the missing piece for me was personifying that voice as my inner roommate. Once I did that, something finally clicked. I feel like I finally got my hands on something that has eluded me my whole life. I can't quite express just how big this feels to me, how life-changing it feels. It's still very early in the process for me, and I have a lot of work ahead of me, but for literally the first time in my life, it actually feels possible to free myself. For years, I've set intentions again and again to release my insecurities, because I could feel the grip they had on me. I could feel how they were limiting me and at times holding my head underwater. And I feel like this practice I've found my way to is the culmination of all those intentions. I always knew it wasn't something that was gonna happen magically just because I was setting the intention. Like, I knew it was probably gonna look like me finding my way to the work that was gonna help me bring that intention to fruition, but I didn't know when or how that was gonna happen, so I felt like I was just stumbling through the dark, hoping I was going in the right direction. But now I can see a light at the end of the tunnel for the first time, and I know I'm going the right way. I just have to follow that light. Even now, my inner roommate is telling me I'm being too dramatic and I need to tone it down. Well, guess what, Lisa? I am dramatic, and I like that about myself. Have a seat. If your name is Lisa, I'm so sorry. I want to circle back to this book, The Untethered Soul. I wasn't ready for this book when I first tried reading it. I started reading it about 2 years ago and got about a quarter of the way through it. When I started doing all this recently and remembered where I got the term inner roommate from, I decided to pick it up again and start from the beginning because I didn't remember much about it, and I also couldn't remember why I didn't finish it. Once I started getting into it, it became very clear to me why I never finished it. For one, I didn't have the context 2 years ago that I do now, and I don't think I was able to fully take in all this information and process it because of that. And two, after rereading the first couple of chapters, I have some beef with this book, but I'm not going to get into that right now because I actually really want to make a video documenting my process of reading this book from start to finish. In just the first 2 chapters, I had so many thoughts and reactions I wanted to share, so I thought it would be a good idea to film it. I am committed to finishing this book despite the critiques I have so far. For as many times as I've gotten pissed off reading it, I have had as many moments where it has resonated with me. I know there is a lot of value to be found in here, and it can only deepen the work that I'm already doing. And I have faith that by the time I'm done reading it, the beef will be squashed. So if you're interested in seeing that video, leave a comment and give this video a thumbs up to let me know. And that, my friends, is all I have for you today. Would love to hear your thoughts on this topic, what insights you have, if this practice is something you have experience with, what you got out of it. Leave a comment, I want to know. Thank you so much for watching. And if you're not subscribed yet, why not? You made it to the end of the video, so clearly we're vibing. And I'd really like to see you again. So if you're a returning subscriber, I love you. I'm so happy you're here. And I'll see you again soon. Bye.